All right. Thank you for watching this virtual lecture event hosted by the Institute of World Politics. For those of you who are new, IWP is a graduate school of national security, intelligence, and international affairs. We have 5 master's degree programs, 18 certificates of study, a doctoral program, and 2 new online Master of Arts programs. If you're interested in learning more about us, please visit iwp.edu. This lecture is a part of the 14th Annual Kościuszko Chair Conference. This conference is sponsored by the Kościuszko Chair of Polish Studies and the Center for Intermarium Studies. We'll be hearing from Dr. John Radzilowski. Dr. Radzilowski has taught history, art history, and geography at University of Alaska Southeast since 2007. Prior to moving to Alaska, he taught history courses at the University of St. Thomas, Hamline University, and Anoka Ramsey College in Minnesota. Dr. Radzilowski also served as Assistant Project Director at the Center for Nations in Transition at the Hubert H. Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota, where he helped design and administer U.S. aid and State Department-sponsored training programs for business, economics, and political science faculty and NGO leaders in Ukraine and East Central Europe. Dr. Radzilowski's research and teaching interests are wide-ranging and diverse, to include immigration and ethnicity, military history, war and genocide, the impact of technology on the history and geography of the Great Plains and Midwest, local and regional studies, and the history of Poland, Russia, Ukraine, and Central and Eastern Europe. Dr. Radzilowski, welcome, and thank you for being with us this afternoon.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to the Kościuszko Chair and IWP for hosting me. And I'm going to share my screen here, and we'll get the presentation started. And right. Well, I'm going to talk today about my title is Forgotten Battlefields, and we're going to talk about the September 1939 campaign in Poland and its role in the history of the Second World War. The term forgotten battlefield was one that cropped up as early as 1944 in reference to the German invasion of Poland in 1939. And this is a campaign that obviously is the first campaign in Europe of the Second World War, but it's a campaign that has been subject to an inordinate number of myths and misunderstandings. And so my talk is really going to focus a little bit on the sort of history of 1939, but also the historiography and why the mythology of 1939 came to dominate the academic and popular histories of this campaign, especially in the West. We're also going to look at a little comparison with the Sino-Japanese War, almost contemporary, occurring in China during this period, which also shares some of the same characteristics of not necessarily perhaps being forgotten, but perhaps misremembered. And one of the things that we can say about it, certainly in Polish, there are several different names for this campaign. There isn't even a single term that's used. Often the September campaign is used, or the Polish Defensive War of 1939 is another term that's used in Polish literature. But we're going to call it the September campaign just for ease of use here today. Now, one of the great myths about, and this was a subject to a lot of myths, and I pulled up this image. It's a title. It's the cover of a war game published 20, 30 years ago. But it kind of perfectly illustrates in one graphic the sort of mythology that arose about 1939 and what I would call the time-life version of the Second World War. If you remember, and this is still on many public library shelves, time-life books did very well illustrated series of books on the Second World War, but really kind of in some ways a mythologized version of some of the events, and certainly the September campaign is a good example of that. But even serious military historians like B.H. Liddell Hart, for example, characterized the Polish defenses as something out of the 19th century. And this His statement was that the Poles were relying on cavalry, like kind of a mid 19th century. They weren't even refighting World War I. They were refighting the Napoleonic Wars, which is, as it turns out, completely false. And a lot of the narrative about the 1939 campaign and the stories that came out of it were really drawn from German propaganda. And Liddell Hart was was not immune from the effects of German propaganda, and he certainly, in some of his writings, sort of reflected a very Germanocentric view. But obviously, the most prevalent myth was that Polish cavalry charged German tanks. That's the illustration you see here, or the Polish Air Force was destroyed on the ground, or any number of other myths about the campaign, all of which were false. Now, over the past 20, 30 years, a lot of those myths have gradually begun to disappear from popular accounts of the Second World War, but they still crop up from time to time. And so the question is, why is this so persistent? And more than that, the campaign, the story of the campaign, the correct story of the campaign really hasn't replaced that old mythological version. So we still have a very cursory examination in most histories of the Second World War. And so it's useful to kind of look at that. And what I call the time life version of the Second World War, featured a lot of, resourceful Americans, plucky Brits, heroic Russians, all getting together to defeat Hitler's legions, which were otherwise up until the Russian winter of 1941 were otherwise invincible. This is the kind of myth, and it is. We'll see. It had a lot. It was able. It provided cover for a lot of different sins, as we'll see, and including it was promoted by Germans, but also in the West, and promoted even in Poland, as we'll see. The Poles were certainly not immune from this either, both the Poles in exile and the communist Poland as well. So let's look a little bit at the campaign. And it's useful to recap, just for a sake of clarity, that Poland was a new country after the First World War. It regained its independence after a long period of foreign subjugation, and had a tremendous number of problems. And certainly the devastating effects of the First World War, exacerbated by the Polish-Soviet War that followed that. And this was a very poor country, a country that had very limited industry, was in modern terms analogous to a third world country, and was also in a very difficult geopolitical situation. As you see on the map, Germany and the Soviet Union are its two major neighbors, both of which were hostile to the new Polish state. Now, Germany was still restricted after the First World War and the Versailles Treaty. Soviet Union was not. So these were both serious threats. The Poles had rather poor relations with Czechoslovakia and very poor relations with Lithuania due to border disputes. They had fairly good relations with the Latvians and the Romanians. But again, Poland was mostly surrounded by fairly hostile forces. And its foreign policy was based on alliance with France. But the French had proved largely unreliable throughout the interwar period. French governments rose and fell. So the Poles were kind of on their own throughout much of the interwar period. But because Germany wasn't a major threat, and the Soviet Union was a threat, but not an immediate threat, at least in the 20s and early 30s, the Poles were able to maintain their independence over about a 21-year period, which will come to an end in 1939. With the rise of Adolf Hitler and the invasion of Poland. But it's useful to remember that Poland was primarily an agrarian country, a country with large minority populations, which were not necessarily happy under Polish rule. So a country with a lot of problems, in short, but problems that we would see in any new democracy. uh, any new country that arose after a long period of having lost its independence. So the problems that Poland had were not abnormal, and if we look around at attempts at nation building, which is now, I guess, a dirty word, and how difficult it is to bring a country into sort of, what we think of as a full Western democracy, even with all the power and resources that the modern West has, which weren't provided to Poland. We can see the sort of the scale of the problems of Poland. And so this was not necessarily unusual that Poland would suffer these problems. But it's very interesting that in the Second World War, Poland will be attacked by two of the most powerful and ruthless totalitarian states the world had ever known. And this very imperfect society, resists with tremendous skill and perseverance. And so, as weak and problematic as interwar Poland might have been in this period, it obviously had strengths and resources that many historians have not fully appreciated. But looking at the Polish defense structure and how Poland responded to the threats that it faced is sort of the first part of what I'll talk about. And obviously in 1933, with the rise of Hitler to power, the threats against Poland began to increase. And this was well recognized by the Poles. This was not necessarily something that they ignored. And in fact, right shortly after Hitler came to power, the Polish leader Józef Pilsudski proposed to the French a joint military operation to remove Hitler from power. The French dismissed this. This was silly warmongering on the part of the Poles. Hitler couldn't possibly be a threat. And so, as a result, the Poles signed a non-aggression pact with the Germans. They had signed one with the Soviets earlier, which gave them a little bit of breathing room. Now, one of the big criticisms of Poland was that it relied on its cavalry, which is sort of cavalry-based army. This is not true. The Polish army was really based as an infantry-based army, like many armies at the time. And so the sort of the core of the Polish army were about 30 frontline infantry. And it had about 10 cavalry brigades. So cavalry made up about 10% of the Polish armed forces at the start of the Second World War. Now, how does this compare with other countries? The U.S. Army in the 1930s, for example, was about a quarter horse cavalry. So Poland had less horse cavalry than a country like the United States. And obviously, we were undergoing the Depression. We had a very small armed forces at the time, not very modernized. But so Poland was certainly not out of whack with regards to cavalry as an arm of the armed forces. And we have to remember that Poland, being a very poor country, did not have a significant automotive industry and did not have a significant number of motor cars or trucks within the country. And so to motorize a single Polish division along the standards of what the German army would have at the start of the Second World War would have required all these civilian vehicles in the country to be confiscated just for one division. So you can see kind of the scale of the problem. The other thing that the Polish cavalry did were essentially Poland was threatened from the east, threatened from the Soviet Union, and so cavalry would be useful in eastern Poland, where it had a very poorly developed road net and a lot of rough terrain, marshes, swamps, mountains. Territory that the cavalry could negotiate. The Poles used their cavalry as a sort of mobile infantry. Polish doctrine was not to line up with lances and sabers and charge the enemy unless there was a situation where the cavalry could surprise an infantry unit, which happened on a number of occasions. But primarily, this was sort of mobile light infantry and not designed to, as you see in some of the old history textbooks, designed to sort of line up and charge with sabers in hand. And so it was nothing like what we see in mythology. And in the late 1930s, the Poles do begin to modernize, and after the death of Pilsudski in particular, the Poles begin to modernize their army. We'll talk a little bit about in a second about the modernization program, but the army was not, most countries, Germany began to modernize its armed forces shortly after Hitler came to power, at least planning for that, and after the reoccupation of the Rhineland. And so Germany's rearmament is really almost contemporaneous with Poland's. The French began a major rearmament at the same time period, so did the British. So the Poles are certainly not behind the eight ball when it comes to modernization. The problem the Poles have is that they don't have the industrial base to support the modernization that the other countries do. The Poles have to build the factories before they can order the weapons, whereas in the case of Germany, the Germans are simply able to order, and they have a large industrial base, and are simply able to begin ordering and planning new equipment, whereas the Poles have to build the infrastructure first. So the Poles are certainly not backward, as a lot of generations of military historians would have laid out for us. And the problem was, again, one of resources. The Poles also have our Navy and Air Force. The Navy was fairly small, but actually quite modernized. Most of its ships, which were primarily based around destroyers and submarines, were fairly modern. The Navy, however, was designed to fight a war against the Soviet Union. Poland's short coastline made it obvious that in the case of the war with Germany, the Navy would be out of action or would have to exit the Baltic Sea. But the Polish Navy was designed to harass Soviet shipping in the case of a war with the Soviet Union. And the Navy, and this is the destroyer Błyskawica, or Lightning, which served throughout the Second World War. It's a museum ship today in Gdynia, but served throughout the Second World War in the Allied cause. The Polish Air Force was actually quite well regarded, had an excellent pilot training program, and its pilots performed extremely well throughout the war. Fairly well modernized. Poland had the first, in the 1920s, Poland had the first all-metal Air Force in the world. They did away with biplanes. But again, Poland's industrial base did not allow it to produce the weapons and the aircraft in the quantity that they needed. So the Poles had some very good designs, in fact, some excellent aircraft designs, but didn't have them in the quantities that they needed. And this was, again, the weakness was industrial, was economic, rather than in terms of the doctrine. And the Poles essentially followed the French doctrine in a lot of these areas. For better or for worse, obviously. As we see the 1940s, the French army had terrific problems. So the Poles certainly weren't, able to, change their doctrine overnight. A couple of the weaknesses the Poles had, and one of these was in command and control. The Pilsudski had left behind a very poor staff and planning apparatus. Pilsudski was a very good sort of practical politician, good in a crisis, guy who's good in a crisis, but not a man who was very good at advanced planning or sort of peacetime management of the armed forces. And so a lot of aspects of staffing and command and control were neglected and continued to be neglected. And so the Poles lacked sufficient modern radios. That was a real weakness. Another important weakness was artillery. The Poles had not developed a significant park of artillery by the time of the Second World War. The main support weapon that the Poles used in this period in the 1930s was a French-designed 75 millimeter field gun. This was a good weapon for its time. It had been really developed prior to the First World War, and this was a sort of modernized version of it, but really inadequate. And heavier artillery was lacking as well, as was the ability to exercise fire control. So the Poles had a number of significant problems. They did have some strengths. They had certainly a very good core of junior officers, even some of the generals. Unfortunately, under Pilsudski, a number of very good generals and leaders had been pushed to the side because they weren't loyal to Pilsudski. Promotion was based on loyalty to Pilsudski, and so often generals, including become the commander-in-chief, General Edward Radzikowski, who's primarily chosen for his loyalty toward Pilsudski. Competent, sort of at a divisional level, but really not able to command a modern army. But at the lower levels, the Poles had quite a number of very good, dedicated, forward-thinking officers. They had some excellent units, including a rather unique unit that's sort of been, again, forgotten, certainly not very well known in the West, and that is the Border Defense Corps. And throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the Soviets continued to sort of rile up the border area. They'd send agents across the border, armed units to disrupt, attack civilians, disrupt Polish government facilities, blow things up. And the regular border police were not able to respond to this. The army, calling in the army was too much, and so they created the Border Defense Corps. It was a sort of light infantry force designed for small unit tactics, border protection, intelligence gathering, and so they were active defending, sort of screening the border areas. Initially in the eastern border with the Soviet Union, but then as things heat up with Nazi Germany, they also take control of the border with Germany as well. Now, one of the great myths about the Polish army and Polish armed forces is they begin the Second World War with antiquated armed forces, and this is certainly not true. The Polish, again, the constraint on the Poles was primarily industrial and economic, not in terms of the equipment that they had. The Poles had some excellent equipment. In fact, some of it was better than their opponents. One good example, for example, is the 7TP tank, which is the main Polish battle tank. And this was superior to the Panzer I and Panzer II fielded by Germany, superior to the T-26 fielded by the Soviets. And although the Poles, again, didn't have them in sufficient quantities, the Poles had more tanks than the U.S. Army did in 1939. Okay, remember, we have to think about, we're not thinking about 1941 or 1942 or 43, we're talking about 1939, which is really a different kind of war that's being fought. Then they'll be fought 2 or 3 years later in terms of the amount and the effectiveness of tanks and other equipment. And so Poles had more tanks than the U.S., more tanks than Italy, which had a well-developed automotive industry and a much more developed industrial base than Poland did. So Poland was certainly not, again, it couldn't match the Soviets in tanks, it couldn't match the Germans in the number of tanks, but certainly could match them in quality. It had, the Poles put a significant amount of emphasis on anti-tank defense. And this is not something, again, that when you read the sort of standard accounts of the Second World War and its September campaign, you don't pick this up in Western sources. But the Poles had excellent anti-tank defenses. Their main anti-tank gun was the Bofors 37mm anti-tank gun. Was being produced under license from the Swedish Bofors company. Was at the time probably the best light anti-tank gun on the market. They also had a very good anti-tank rifle, the Model 35 anti-tank rifle. A very simple weapon, essentially a bolt-action rifle, but with a unique tungsten core round that would flatten on impact. And it's really kind of a precursor to a lot of modern anti-tank rounds that are commonly used since the Second World War. But instead of penetrating the armor of the tank, it would flatten against the side of the tank and transfer the kinetic energy into the tank, create spalling on the inside, which would be metal shards that would fly off the inside of the armor of the tank. which would injure or kill the crew or cause damage and disable the tank. And this was, again, a very effective weapon. In terms of aircraft, the PZL-37 Wash or Moose medium bomber was probably the best medium bomber in the world. It was certainly superior. It could fly higher and faster with a heavier bomb load than its counterparts, and certainly superior to any of its Soviet counterparts. So the Poles had a very good array of weaponry. The problem was they couldn't deploy it in the numbers. The Polish modernization program was really slated to run through 1942, and deliveries of weapons were slated for the later part of the modernization program. Now, one of the criticisms of the Poles, well, why didn't they just purchase arms from the British or the French or the Czechs? And the problem there was that neither the British nor the French wanted to sell the Poles their best equipment. They wanted to sell the Poles their cast-off, their second-line equipment, which was already way out of date. The Czechs wanted to charge the Poles an arm and a leg, and so the Poles simply couldn't afford that. And so to fund their modernization program, one of the things the Poles did was to sell arms to other countries. So they were selling aircraft, for example, to Bulgaria and Greece and Turkey, and aircraft that probably could have been kept at home. But they needed to do this to earn the cash to keep their weapons programs running. And so again, the constraints on the Poles were primarily economic. And just to keep this in perspective, a German panzer division at the start of the Second World War had a budget greater than the entire Polish army, just to give you an understanding of the scale. And it wasn't like the Poles were not spending a significant part of their GDP on defense. They were. The Soviet Union was number one in the late 1930s in terms of European countries spending this percentage of GDP on defense. Poland was number two. Germany was number three. So the Poles were using a lot of their economic output to fund this modernization. But the Polish economy was just so small that compared to their two competitors, East and West, this was much smaller than they really needed at the time. Now, one of the advantages the Poles did have was in intelligence and code breaking, and the Poles were able to break the German military codes, and that's a story that's hopefully fairly well known, and pass that on to the British and the French at the start of the Second World War, and they were able to crack the Enigma codes. They had broken Red Army codes too. Certainly during the 1920s and 30s, they were able to read Red Army traffic. There is some indication that they may have broken Red Army codes during the war as well, but that's the evidence on that is not as clear. But they had a very advanced intelligence operation, and they had agents throughout Germany, throughout Europe, and the Poles were very well informed about German plans. By the time of the day that the war started, September the 1st, the Poles had identified over 90% of the German forces arrayed against them, their disposition and their order of battle. So they had a very good picture of what they were facing. So again, this wasn't a surprise. It wasn't certainly a surprise as far as the Poles were concerned. Now, this is the German plan. This is a standard U.S. Army history map. And the German plan envisioned overwhelming the country within 2 weeks and using armored spearheads, one of which would transit across the Polish corridor in the north through East Prussia, attack Warsaw from the north. The other would essentially move up through Silesia, attack sort of in a pincer movement, sort of envelop Western Poland. This was at least the plan. It didn't quite work out this way, a lot as most plans do. The Poles, by contrast, the Polish strategy was designed first and foremost because the Poles recognized that in an event with a war with Germany, they would not be able to win outright. And so the Polish goal was to make sure that the French and also the British will sign alliance with the Poles, make sure the British and the French enter the war. The Poles had observed what happened in Czechoslovakia, and how the British and the French had acted with regards to their alliance with the Czechs, and wanted to ensure that in the case of a war with Germany, that Germany didn't come in to seize Danzig or seize some of the border territories that Hitler claimed he wanted and then declare the conflict over. The Poles needed to ensure that the Germans engaged a major Polish army unit, so they couldn't just write it off as a border incident and leave it at that. They needed to draw the French and the British into the conflict. So that was step number one. And so this is one of the reasons why they positioned their forces relatively far forward. In addition to that, the areas that the Poles are defending in the early stages of the campaign are the most populous and most heavily ethnically Polish areas. And so those are the kind of core areas of the country, are unfortunately located relatively close to the German border. So they couldn't just be abandoned without a fight. But the plan was that once the Poles had engaged the German forces, they were going to gradually withdraw to the southeast and toward the Romanian border in the south. And Romania was a friendly country, and the idea was they could be resupplied through Romania from Britain and France. The southeastern area of the country was also very, very rough, very mountainous, and the Poles had stockpiled a lot of the reserve supplies in this area. So the idea was sort of this gradual withdrawal to the southeast. Problem was, of course, that the Poles greatly underestimated, as many people did, the speed of the German army's advance. And as we'll see, an additional problem the Poles had was that this dependence on the French and the British meant that when Hitler begins to threaten Poland, when German armies in August of 1939 began to mass on Poland's border, the Poles want to declare full mobilization. But they're stopped by the French. On two occasions, and the days right before the start of the war, the Poles declare a full mobilization, but they're stopped by French and British diplomatic intervention. And the British and the French essentially say, if you mobilize, we're not going to come help you. And so the Poles pull back, and they really don't fully mobilize until the very last minute, which means a lot of their forces, include about a third to a half of Polish forces, were not in place at the start of the war, which was really, I think, one of the fatal flaws, one of the fatal problems that Poland experienced in the campaign. And so this was, but again, this was the result of having to rely on your British and French partners, so to speak, for your defense. The war begins on September the 1st, 1939, with the attack at Westerplatte, in the city of Danzig, which is a Polish transit station. It's attacked by the battleship Schleswig-Holstein, but it actually turns out to be rather a fiasco for the Germans. They plaster the little garrison and then march in, assuming that the Poles are mostly wiped out. And in fact, Germans suffer very heavy casualties. A lot of the September campaign was really sort of bitterly fought infantrymen's battle. For all of the talk about mechanized forces, and they were important, a lot of the fighting is really kind of up close and personal, and it's really Germany's overwhelming material superiority and their overwhelming firepower superiority that allows them to prevail as they did. However, it is not, as we'll see, the kind of walkover that's been portrayed in a lot of Western history accounts. And a good example of that is the Battle of Mocha on September the 1st. It was one of the first battles of the war. And Mocha is an area near Częstochowa, and was right in the path of sort of one of the main German attacks. And it's essentially attacking toward Częstochowa and beyond Częstochowa toward Łódź and Piotrków and Warsaw. And so it's really kind of the main axis of one of the initial German attacks. And the area around Mocha is screened by the Wolinska Cavalry Brigade, and reinforced by a couple of other smaller units. And they're set up in a wooded area near the border, and most of the troops are concealed in wooded terrain. And the cavalry are, of course, dismounted. This is as I said, sort of typical setup of the Polish cavalry. I've interviewed veterans of the campaign, and what essentially happened is about 5 o'clock in the morning, Germans crossed the border, began to advance toward Polish positions, and kind of tentatively, they're not. It's foggy. It's a lot of mist. They're not really sure where the Poles are, and at about 8 o'clock in the morning, they begin to advance toward the main Polish positions. They're not sure that where the Poles exactly are located, so they begin shelling the wooded areas, trying to provoke a response to the Poles. But one of the veterans I interviewed was in command of the anti-tank gun section, the Bofor anti-tank guns that I showed you previously, and his orders were to keep his men down and quiet until the Germans got very, very close. And so as the Germans are firing into the woods, they're not getting any response from the woods, and so they begin to advance more confidently. Tanks with some infantry begin to creep forward. They wait. The Poles wait. It's 500 yards, 400 yards. At 150 meters, he orders his men to stand to their guns and open fire. It's really almost point blank range, and the result is this massacre. The German tanks are wiped out left and right. They begin to fall back. They fall back a couple hundred meters, but they're still well within range of the Polish guns, and they take even heavier losses. The infantry are left on the field under Polish small arms fire and pinned down. And so it's the fiasco. The Germans attack again at 10 o'clock. And backing up in the sort of rear of the Polish line is the railroad embankment. And the Germans managed to break through the railroad embankment. But at that moment, a Polish armored train with heavy guns roars down the track right through the middle of the German advance. And just basically, heavy cannons and turrets basically wipe out a number of the German tanks, force them to withdraw again. At noon, over 100 German tanks launch another major attack and again break through to the rail line, but are again repelled. By the last stages of the battle, in the early afternoon, a number of tanks try to cross the rail line, but it's a high railroad embankment. The tanks can only cross at certain points. Some of the tanks cross, but some of the tanks in the middle over the crossing get knocked out, start on fire, trapping some of the tanks on the other side of the rail line. German panzer troops begin to panic. They begin to basically jump out of their vehicles and run for the German border. Over approximately 200 German tanks are destroyed. Our tanks and armored cars are destroyed, between about 150 and 200 at Mocha. The image of German tank panzer troops running in panic, abandoning their vehicles, running in panic back toward the German border is not the image that we get from most of the literature of the 1939 campaign. But in many instances, when the Germans run into Polish positions, this is the result. Neither army, of course, particularly experienced this. Most people are brand new to combat, but the Germans get the worst of a lot of these initial conflicts. In the air, even though the Polish Air Force is smaller and its equipment is in some cases out of date, and this is the P-11, which was the frontline Polish fighter. It was much slower than its German counterparts, but much more maneuverable. But Poles had very good pilots. And so we're able to defeat some of the initial German bombing raids on Warsaw. The P-11 in the hands of a good pilot could outturn the Messerschmitt 109. It was not fast enough to catch up to it, but could outturn it. And so in the hands of a good pilot, it could deal with an ME-1, even with an ME-109. But we're definitely outclassed. And so the Polish Air Force puts up a very good account of itself in the first few days of the conflict. Again, able to repel a lot of the German air raids on central Poland. And So the other myth, of course, about the September campaign is the Polish Air Force is all destroyed on the ground for the war, which again, the evidence shows completely the opposite. Now, the problem was that the Germans had, in the Poles were not able to maintain a continuous front line. And the advantage, it turns out, of German motorized forces is not they have these tanks that are going to roll over Polish positions. When again, as we see at Mocha, when Germans are running up against these Polish positions, they're getting massacred. The advantage of the motorized forces is they're able to find the gaps in the Polish positions. And we know, for example, the German reconnaissance forces suffer very heavy casualties as they're probing for these gaps. But they do find the gaps, and so they're able to outflank the Polish positions and get around them. And so there's several stages now occur. There's a initial battle for the borders in the first few days. September 3rd, the Allies finally declare war, but really do nothing. There's a Polish counterattack then as the Germans break through. The German intelligence was terrible. They lost track of two whole Polish armies in Western Poland, which then counterattack. German motorized forces were able to respond, however, and sort of staunch the bleeding. But the war really continues to heat up. And Polish forces are falling back. They're suffering very heavy losses, but they're giving a very good account of themselves. We know this because German losses peak in the third week of the conflict. So it's not until the third week the Germans are suffering their heaviest losses, as Polish forces are able to coalesce around the bastions, Warsaw, Lvov, the seacoast, the Modlin, and as the Germans begin to encounter more difficult terrain. And so the myth of the Germans sort of rolled over the Poles, and that was that. Was really, as we see, quite false. In fact, the Germans understood this very well. In German literature during the war, up until the invasion of Russia, within the Battle of Moscow, the September campaign was considered by the Germans to be their toughest test of their armed forces, and they in their internal literature recognized that. As a result, one of the things that happens is sort of terror bombing. The city of Warsaw is destroyed. The Germans are waging war not just on the Polish armed forces, but on civilians. This is one of the other important features of the September campaign that tends to be overlooked, is that this was Germans began immediately killing civilians in large numbers. The use of Einsatzgruppen, which will be used in the Holocaust, particularly with Operation Barbarossa, are pioneered in 1939 against the Poles. These units that come behind the main armies and shoot prisoners of war, shoot civilians in large numbers. And really the German armed forces, the Air Force and the Army participate in war crimes in a huge number. In France and in the French campaign of 1940, there's about 16 different massacres of civilians and POWs that are carried out by German forces. In 1939, there are roughly 16 massacres occurring every day of the campaign in Poland. So it's a completely different scale than what happened. But it's really a prefiguring of the sort of war of racial extermination that Germany is going to wage beginning in 1941 with the invasion of the Soviet Union. Speaking of the Soviet Union, of course, the Soviet forces attack on September the 17th, which any hope the Polish defenses had of coalescing in southeastern Poland are destroyed. The Poles have very few forces to resist the Soviet advance, but they do. The Sarny bunkers, for example, Lieutenant Jan Bolbot, whose picture is here, has a scratch force of Border Defense Corps troops, 50 men, up against thousands of Soviet troops. They hold out all day long, fight to the last man. In one instance, the Soviet forces were going to perform very poorly in Finland. They performed very poorly in Poland as well. In one instance, a Polish cavalry squadron encounters a regiment of Soviet tanks. They have an anti-tank rifle with only a couple rounds left. They put a couple tanks out of action. Then they knock out more tanks using Molotov cocktails. They run out of Molotov cocktails. Local peasants come with bottles of kerosene. So they knock out more tanks with bottles of kerosene. Finally, they run out of kerosene, and there's still Soviet tanks milling around. They have no infantry support, and so one of the Polish commanders gets a blacksmith's hammer, a sledgehammer, and jumps up on top of the Soviet tank and begins to smash the radio equipment, the periscopes, and the machine gun to put it out of action. But the Soviets suffered very heavy losses. We don't know how many because has been it's still covered up. But the resistance was tremendous, and it certainly didn't stop at any point. But this leads, of course, to the partition of Poland, beginning of the Second World War. Now, one of the features that I wanted to look at is sort of why all of this was forgotten. Well, I say it's a forgotten campaign, but perhaps it's better to call it misremembered, and perhaps deliberately misremembered. And if we want to look at a comparison, we can look at the Sino-Japanese War from 1937, and then leading into the Second World War in Asia, and the story, the time life story, if you will, of the Sino-Japanese War is the Japanese sort of march through, and the Chinese nationalist forces under Chiang Kai-shek are completely unable to resist them, and Chiang Kai-shek is corrupt and competent, and he's only concerned about fighting the communists, and only the communists fight the Japanese. And this is sort of the myth, and this, of course, there's a lot of literature. Richard Frank's recent book, Tower of Skulls, among others, as well as work by Chinese scholars, has demonstrated that this is, in fact, completely false. The Chinese forces put up tremendous resistance. Japanese forces suffered very heavy losses during the campaign. And in fact, and of course, again, like Poland, China had a very small industrial base, didn't have very modernized forces, and yet obviously much larger scale in terms of the total numbers, but put up tremendous resistance. And I think a good example of that is the Battle of Zhuhai in April of 1938 is Japanese forces are advancing south after taking Shanghai. They run into a number of fortified villages, and most of the Chinese troops facing them in the Battle of Zhuhai were second-line troops. They weren't Chiang Kai-shek's sort of core Central Army forces. They weren't these German-trained forces. They were actually more of this the regional forces, which were not nearly as well trained or equipped. And they put up tremendous resistance in many instances. For example, in the village of Tingshan, the 122nd elements of 122nd Chinese Division fight to the last man. They're attacked repeatedly by heavy artillery, aircraft, tanks, but inflicts huge casualties on the Japanese as well, and are able to really resist and counterattack the Japanese. In fact, China becomes a quagmire for Japan. The Japanese can't extricate themselves. Throughout the Second World War, the Japanese are committing almost 1 million soldiers to defend, to occupy China. And that's in addition to armies of the Chinese puppet government that they're employing as well. And comparably, by the way, the Poles throughout the Second World War tied down over 500,000 German troops in just occupying Poland, and so these campaigns appear successful on one hand, but they don't necessarily mirror the success over the long term. The Japanese eventually will take Zhuhai, but again, the Chinese forces are able to withdraw. Now, the question is, and I think why these campaigns have been treated in this way, and I would suggest that, as I say, they're not just forgotten; they're misremembered. In the case of China, a lot of that was influenced by the writing of General Joe Stilwell, who was the American proconsul in China, hated Chiang Kai-shek, really didn't like the Chinese much either, was a man just full of resentments, and his memoirs really came to dominate literature. But let's also think about what happened after the war. In Poland, of course, the Soviets take over, and the Allied alliances with the Poles are pushed to the side in deference to the Soviets. Allied performance in the early parts of the war, particularly the British and the French, was incompetent. Their military efforts, their political efforts were utterly feckless. And so if Poland can't defend itself, then it doesn't matter, right? It sort of takes the sting out of this, and it excuses a lot of the mistakes that the British and the French made in the early part of the war. Had the Germans launched most of their forces against Poland, they had very few defending the border with France. Had the French launched a vigorous counteroffensive into Germany in 1939. The war might have turned out very differently and much shorter. Again, counterfactual, we can't predict that. But they certainly abandoned both the British and the French abandoned the Poles in 1939 after urging them not to mobilize their forces. Iran and Yalta, the Americans are certainly not interested in supporting the Poles. The Soviets, of course, aren't interested in supporting the Poles. The Germans, this is obviously their mythology, and really builds on the mythology of the sort of the power and prowess of the Wehrmacht, the sort of clean Wehrmacht mythology that comes in at the end of the Second World War to kind of exculpate the German army from the crimes of Nazism. All of these play into the sort of myth of 1939. The Poles themselves, the Polish communist government, had obviously a great disdain for the pre-war government, but also the Poles in exile, the Polish government in exile, were opponents of the pre-war government, and so they had no love lost for the Sanacja government that followed Pilsudski. So even the Poles had very little interest in sort of challenging the myths of 1939. But similarly, in the case of China, at the end of the war, the communists, the Chinese Revolution, Mao Zedong's communist forces, with assistance from the Soviets, manages to defeat Chiang Kai-shek, and the nationalists have to flee to Taiwan, where their successors reside today. And a whole question broke out over who lost China. Well, if China was undefendable, if Chiang Kai-shek was totally incompetent and corrupt, clearly, no matter what the Americans did, it wouldn't have mattered, right? So portraying Chiang Kai-shek as an incompetent fool and a corrupt leader sort of covered a lot of faults, if you will, and was able to excuse a lot of faults. And similarly, in the 1939 campaign, we see this. If Poland or China couldn't defend themselves, they were totally incompetent. Then it didn't really matter what any of their allies did. When in fact, both, I think it's quite arguable, both at the end of the Second World War, our failure to support the nationalists contributed to the communist takeover, and certainly in excusing, writing Poland off made it easier to accept the Soviet domination of Poland after the war. So these accounts, these mythologies, persisted precisely because of post-war politics and Cold War politics, but in a way that was designed to exculpate Western governments and Western leaders from some of the mistakes that they made. But in the end, this was obviously a terrible tragedy for both Poland and China. Even to this day, and this was just recently discovered in Warsaw, the site of civilians who were massacred in 1939 toward the end of the campaign, just near Warsaw, by German forces. And both certainly Poland became a sense of plaything for the great powers, and its civilian population suffered under Soviet rule, under Nazi rule. just as China suffered suffered tremendously under communist rule. And so by remembering these campaigns correctly, we provide some measure of, if not justice, at least some truth telling for the people who suffered so much from these campaigns. And with that, I'll bring it to a conclusion. So I thank you very much for listening. And if you have questions, you can certainly pass them on to me through the Institute for World Politics. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions you want to send by email. So thank you very much.